Sweet. So it's hard to define narrative. I tried to sit down and think about, what do I want to say about what narrative is, because it functions in so many different ways. There's the sort of narrative that all of us engage in. It's universal as human beings, as creatures, as living things. There's a narrative that affects all of us who, are born and go through life and have to die. There's a natural narrative arc there. I wanted to talk about narrative as being context, because in some sense, I think the narrative is, it's what gives flesh to events and things that happen to us. It's what allows us, to make value judgments about them, the how and the why did it matter and what just happened and how did it impact me. But it seems that narrative is more than just context, because especially when you're talking about, an artist and what they're creating, there's a volitional act involved where narrative, it takes its form from the conscious or sometimes unconscious choices that the artist is making to put together a story in a certain way. So, I might choose as I'm writing a story to write a story about a specific person. I might be writing a story about someone in the South, and there's a legacy of slavery that is going to impact that narrative. That's going to be there. I might be writing a story about a woman in Bangladesh, and there's certain details of the Hindu and Muslim conflict, of family dynamics, of the caste system. All of these things are going to play into the contextuality of that story. And as I tell that story, I'm going to make choices about what to bring to the forefront that's going to inform you as a reader or as a listener of what's important in that person's life, what I believed was important to tell you, what you should know about that person and what they went through and the choices that they made. So I think narrative, it has a very important and significant function in not only guiding those choices as a writer and an artist, but also informing you, as a participant of what should you be paying attention to? What do you need to learn from this? What do they want you to know? And some of those choices are obvious and it's clear that you're making them, and some of them aren't, because all of us, of course, existing, in a certain social structure and milieu, a lot of those values we pick up. A lot of those things we don't even think about. We put them on the page. Narrative can be dynamic and important as a tool in social structures. Narrative, as it was used in the Soviet Union, is no exception. So if you guys are familiar or not familiar with the history of the Soviet Union, how it came about, there is a point in Russia's history where, as a people, they were really suffering under the Romanov dynasty, and so there was a tremendous amount of pressure from the top not to say certain things and not to print certain things. People like Dostoevsky, as part of the Petrushevsky circle, ran into that. He was picked up with a bunch of other guys who had been, reading and circulating verboten French literature, and he was sentenced to death and nearly executed, although it was commuted at the last moment. But the sort of pressure from the social hierarchies, the political hierarchies, and the suffering from, lack of food and the defeats that they had endured during World War I, and also the legacy of having brushed shoulders with a lot of the folks who came in with Napoleon and his army, bringing in all of these ideas of what it means to be human and liberty and fraternity, how things ought to be run, were fomenting in the culture at the time. And the Germans took advantage of that. So during World War I, they'd been fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front, and to, mixed success. But somebody got the bright idea, hey, how we can get these Russians off our back? Well, the Tsar and the Tsarina, their power is pretty tenuous. They got Rasputin over there, and people aren't happy about that, that's a fascinating story if you guys don't know about that. But Anyway, they said, you know what we need to do? We need to divide them from within. We need to take advantage of the conflict that they're experiencing at home right there, and we need to get a fuse in there. We need to get a match to light that powder keg. So they found Lenin, who had been ejected from Russia a while before, and he was a revolutionary leader. He was living in Switzerland at the time, and they put him on a train, and they sent him back home. Said, "Here you go," and they let him loose in Russia, and he immediately got in contact with his old buddies, and got the Bolsheviks back together, and with the help of the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries and a number of other parties, they succeeded in toppling the government and taking power. And almost immediately, they began changing things. They wanted to see a workers' paradise. They wanted to see society turned on its head. They wanted to see the abolition of things like private property and the sort of just the strictures that they'd been operating under for so many years. And one of the ways that they decided that they were going to go about that was through violence. And if you go back and you read through Lenin's writings, it's kind of shocking how the blueprint that he set out for what ended up happening in the Soviet Union over the successive 30 and 40 years, it was laid out at the beginning. I mean, he basically said in no uncertain terms, I mean, we need to get rid of certain social elements and purify this country, for lack of a better word. And it's going to take thousands of lives. So they got started on that project. Narrative was essential in the Soviet project, and narrative in the arts was no exception. As you can imagine, for a country that's trying to go from backwards to 60 in as quick as they can, and who are facing pressures from all sorts of other governments around them, they needed to ramp up production, they needed to feed their people, they needed to industrialize as quickly as they could. So there were narratives that were officially sanctioned by the government, and that was what was given to the people. It was things like, productivity in industry as like one of the highest values. You show your love for the motherland by producing. You get out there, you work, you become, Kelly and I sometimes joke about the Stakhanovite. There was like any other bean counting country, everything's measured in your output. And that output is measured in, are you meeting your norms or not? And what percentage of your norms are you meeting? Well, you have to establish those norms somehow, right? So there's this really tragicomic story about a particular, I think it was a mining operation, where they decided, okay, we are going to find out exactly how much ore your average miner can mine in a given day. So they got this guy whose last name was Stakhanovich to get in there and go down the mine and spend his 10 hours pulling up ore, and then they were going to measure it at the end of the day. Well, this guy was a monster. I mean, they found like the biggest, healthiest ox of a guy that they could to go down in there in the mines and work, and they gave him every advantage that they could, so that by the end of the day, I mean, the amount of ore he brought out there was like triple what anybody else was averaging. But they said, hey, this is our norm. This is what you can do in a day. Awesome. So that became the new norm. And that became the line, like, you produce, like, you do this. So as a consequence, you saw artists coming out with works that towed that same line. These were works of fiction that idolized the producing worker. It was man loves tractor sort of stories, and it's not really surprising that happened, because if you were a writer, if you wanted to write in the Soviet Union and get published, you had to be employed as a writer by the state. You were part of the writers' union, and your work didn't just get published; it had to be proposed for publication by, a magazine or a publisher or something like that. And then they would send it on, first, like, that magazine would have an editorial staff that would look it over and kind of vet it and go, well, this is coming from a pretty good source. I mean, this guy's parents were workers, like, they weren't white, they weren't white guards. He comes from a proletarian background. He's saying the right things. He doesn't criticize Stalin. The story mirrors the current narrative. So, and they send it up, and it would get reviewed by, somebody up at the Kremlin who was a bureaucrat who happened to hold the office of, like, czar of culture. Wasn't necessarily a writer themselves, but they knew what the line was. They knew what the party line was. And they could smell that out if this piece of writing that they were reading was following it or it wasn't. If it followed it, sure, rubber stamp it. If it wasn't, axe it. So I was going to read you guys some. There's some great stories out there. There's one in here called Nor Bibi's Crime, which is quite good, actually. It's well written by Vera Inber. And it's about this young woman who becomes a wife in a village that's part of, one of those kind of Kazakh communities that's living on the east side of the Caspian Sea, and was part of one of those, Soviet republics that was sucked into the Union at some point. And, she's part of some kind of yurt living hunter-gatherer or nomadic horse people that have lived, and died out there for thousands of years. And the story portrays both her life as someone who, enters into marriage very young, tries her hand at raising silkworms, which was, I guess, like the local economy in this village. Has to deal with persecution and spousal abuse, and in the meantime, the Soviet is trying to update. They're trying to communalize the families and their industry, and they're bringing in folks that are going to help teach them the new ideology and help reorganize their processes along the new Soviet line. Okay, so I was going to read this to you. It's kind of interesting. Sisters, said Muhabbat, here before you is the woman Nor Bibi. We all know her. Let us speak about this woman's life. And again there was a rustling, and once more it subsided. In the old days, our women had 5 masters. Isn't that too many? And yet it was so. The first master was God. The second master was the emir. The third master was the one who gave work, in whose will and power were the land and the water. The fourth master was the mullah. The fifth master was the husband. Sisters, we are here to judge the woman Nor Bibi, because she has freed herself from 4 masters, but has kept the 5th. Before the revolution, they used to sell us for money, for rice, exchanged us against all kinds of goods. As children, we were married to old men. And why are you crying, Nor Bibi? To old men who, besides us, had other wives. They stole our childhood from us, but we were silent. Nor Bibi, you are guilty of having kept silent too long. Is she guilty, sisters? And the sisters, with tear-filled eyes, replied, She is guilty. Stand up, Nor Bibi, look us in the eyes. You are guilty of not having had sufficient faith in your own strength. You are afraid of leaving your husband. You are afraid that the Soviet power would abandon you halfway, that it was remote and great and did not see your small life. But it has seen it. And this power is I, all of us, and you yourself, Nor Bibi. Remember, you are young, Nor Bibi. You are healthy. You can work. Well, there is little I know how to do, Muhabbat, Nor Bibi replied in a low voice. But the wonderful courtyard repeated her words so clearly that all heard them. There is little you know how to do, Muhabbat swept the court with her eyes as though seeking an answer. And this is how Shura later described the scene in a letter to her father. You understand, Nor Bibi said very low, but all heard her. There is little I know how to do. And Muhabbat, this lovely, this clever woman, this treasure, looked around the whole court as though seeking an answer. And then on all sides there caught her eyes, there simply crawled towards her Azim Jan's posters. especially the one with the Uzbek woman in the cocoons, and she, my Muhabbat, stretched out her gnarled brown fingers towards the poster. Now this, she said, you know how to do, don't you? All is open to you, but you had forgotten it. What a pity, what a great pity you did not hear them judge Noor Bibi and sentence her to freedom and happiness. So I'm not going to comment on, like the question of whether her life was better or not better after this change in Soviet power, but just to focus on the narrative choices, it's really striking how there's a very specific and clearly articulated narrative that the writer wants you as the reader to pick up on, right? It's the progress that the Soviet power is bringing. It's the benefit for the people in these areas. It's the humanization and civilization of their culture and their ways. It's the elevation of this woman from the position she had been in to the position she finds herself in now. And that's all thanks to the state and thanks to the impact of the state's agents. So, I find that interesting. I'll read you guys another one here. So this one was written during World War II. I'll just read a little bit of it. It's called the Third Adc. The Commissar firmly believed that brave men got killed less often than cowards. He frequently said so and hated to be contradicted. In the division, he was both liked and feared. He had his own method of accustoming men to the war. He read a man's character, as it were, and they went along. Picking him out at divisional HQ or in the regiment, he would take him, without letting him leave his side, to all the places that he had to visit in the course of the day. If they had to take part in an attack, he kept the man with him and advanced at his side. If the man stood the test, in the evening the Commissar would make his acquaintance anew. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly in an abrupt voice. The surprised officer gave his name. "My name's Kornev," the Commissar would then say, stretching out his hand. "We advanced together. We flopped down on our bellies together. Now let's get acquainted." In the first week after joining the division, he lost 2 aides-de-camps. The first, succumbing to fear, had climbed out of the trench to crawl to the rear. A machine gun got him. In the evening, as he was returning to HQ, the Commissar strode indifferently past the body of his aide-de-camp without even turning his head. The second aide-de-camp was shot through the chest during an attack, and he lay on his back in the recaptured trench, gasping for air, and begged for a drink. There was no water. In the field outside the breastwork lay German corpses. Near one of them, a flask was lying. Taking out his field glasses, the Commissar looked for a long time as if trying to make out whether the flask was full or empty. Then, heaving his heavy, no longer youthful body over the breastwork with an effort, he started across the field at his usual unhurried pace. For some reason, the Germans held their fire. They began to shoot only when he had reached the flask and picked it up, shaken it, and turned, with the flask clutched fast under his arm. They were shooting at his back. 2 bullets hit the flask. He stopped the holes with his fingers and went on, carrying the flask in his outstretched hands. Jumping down into the trench, he handed the flask carefully, lest the water escape, to one of the men. "Give him a drink." "Well, what if you'd found it empty when you'd reached it?" someone asked curiously. "I'd have come back and sent you to find another, a full one," the Commissar replied, measuring the questioner with an unfriendly look. He often did things which, as Commissar of the division, he had no need to, but remembered this fact only after having done so. And goes on, goes on, goes on. So it's like, it's not very well written, but you can imagine, as a soldier, right, who's in the trenches. I mean, how if you're a political officer and every unit traveled with one, how useful something like this would be, right? Something that would communicate to your soldiers, like, this is what it is to be a soldier. This is what it is to live and die and fight for your motherland. Like, and if you're brave, you're probably going to live longer. I mean, everybody knows that. Like, yeah, it's just, it's funny. What were some of the other? Were there some other narrative elements you guys picked up on in there? In either of those? Well, they were pretty.
I like the fact that you're writing, you're describing the stories in such ways that there's a sort of new social motif. Especially with the first story, it's like trying to explain to people how they fit into the world, like almost as if the narratives have to be constructed anew. Like, the revolution has come. What does it mean now that I'm this kind of person?
Yeah.
And how I like that you're drawing that out. Oh, I'm done. Just
No, I mean it's true that oftentimes you have narratives that are built to reflect the needs of a certain time, and either they're going to reflect a cultural current that's already there. Trying to find an example for that. I mean, something like Huck Finn, I don't think the official narrative at the time was that, black people are just as much people as any other people, but that certainly was Twain's opinion, and that's what he has Huck voicing. So, and other narratives are, they're coined based on the needs of the time, and I think that's a lot of what we're seeing here. In our country, we've done the same thing. I think about like Manifest Destiny. It was a huge narrative that fulfilled a certain role, and I can't imagine how powerful that must have been as an American narrative assumption, if you were alive at that time. Like, that would have been fascinating just to have that set of lenses on. So, I mean, they're specifically Soviet in a way. They're not, the second one, the one about bravery and fighting for the motherland, I think you'd find that one elsewhere. But it certainly was a huge factor in their country and in their story. The earlier one about, the positive effects of socialism in the life of Noor Bibi, is much more Soviet in character. And particularly socialist in how you see Noor Bibi's, personal problems and her personal growth coming through changes in, her socio-political and economic situation. So it's just a huge assumption in socialism, period. I mean, it's a materialistic system that says that all of mankind's problems can be boiled down to, inequalities or injustices in your modes of production and in the means of transaction of what is produced. And they would just call that economics and politics right there. So you solve those things and you solve mankind's other issues, other problems. Of course, there's other people that, since those opinions were first coined by folks like Rousseau and Marx, they wanted to take a different route, and they were criticizing those ideas from the very beginning. And I think about, significantly Dostoevsky with Crime and Punishment and with the Brothers Karamazov. If you've read those, they're wonderful, wonderful books where he uses narrative really effectively to give you a character who, in the narrative arc of the story, is going to play out the consequences of holding certain ideas and certain ideologies. So, in Crime and Punishment, your main character, Raskolnikov, he's a young student who's enamored with socialist ideals. He's poor, he's miserable, and he gets it into his head that the way to solve his problems is he's going to murder this old woman who's a moneylender who he owes money to. And he's going to get her wealth, he's going to take it and put it to better use, because it's better used on a poor student who's got the right ideology than in the hands of this woman who's, basically like lording her wealth over people. So he kills her. And then the rest of the story is the gradual unraveling of his psychology as he can't sit with the fact that he's done this horrible thing, this thing that ideologically he's justified to himself. Something in him, something in his humanity balks at that and says, no, you did something bad. You can't justify that. And slowly, more and more, his will to triumph and escape is translated into a will to be free of this burden of guilt and a desire to make good on what he's done. Brothers Karamazov, you get this fantastic picture of these three sons of a father who's like the most magnificent lech that you'll ever read in the pages of fiction. And the name Karamazov literally means black spot, and they all share that. They all have that, right? But the sons react to their father's evil in I think what Dostoevsky wanted to explore were three very typically human ways. You have an older brother who basically just is like an animal. I mean, he's passionate, he lives, he goes out, he fights, he makes love, he drinks, he's just living life, as hard and as fast as he can, to forget. The middle brother, Ivan, he's approaching life through the intellect, and he's become enamored with the new socialist ideals. The youngest brother, Alyosha, he's trying to become a monk. He's gone the religious route. And through the course of the story, you get to kind of see how those three different ways of approaching life and facing into the question of your own humanity, whether they're effective or not, whether they work. Is it profitable for Mitya, the oldest brother, to end his life, through carousing? I mean, does it give him what he wants ultimately? For Ivan, is in the games that he plays with his ideas and mentally, is he able to sit with how he's reconciled his father and how he's reconciled himself to the situation, or does it drive him mad? With the youngest brother, in wrestling with the reality of his own humanity and his own participation in his father's brokenness, which is also his own brokenness, does the life of the spirit actually provide a compelling answer? Does it give him the resources in order to embrace his fellow man and say, you know what, I'm still going to love people, and I'm still going to get up in the morning and, try to make the best out of every day, and I'm still going to try to learn. Anyway, I think he does it masterfully. I suggest you guys read that if you ever get the chance. So, clearly somebody like Dostoevsky is looking at the culture around him, which is moving, more and more in the direction of, well, we're all just material beings and with material concerns, and you got to get what you can now, and that's all there is. I think he comes up with some very compelling narratives that portray another narrative, another way of looking at life, and another way of being human. So somebody who was very much in that vein was Solzhenitsyn. He was born in 1918. He was like a child of the revolution. I mean, very auspicious, born the same year. Grew up in a town that was constantly, when he was a child, it was changing hands between the whites and the reds as they were fighting for dominance in the revolution. He grew up to study mathematics and literature in university, and he ended up becoming an artillery officer in the Second World War. Incredibly bright guy, and with most people who are probably brighter than they need to be, he saw a lot of the contradictions and hypocrisies in the culture around him, and he was picked up one day by his own commissar because he had, in writing letters with a friend of his from school, He had made some thinly veiled, cutting jokes about Uncle Joseph, and so they picked him up and stripped him of his rank, and put him on a train to the Lubyanka, which was this massive prison fortress in Moscow, where the KGB, which was then the NKVD, and then the MGB before that, interrogated folks and extracted confessions from them and sentenced them to various crimes, and then sent them packing to the Gulag. He had been writing for most of his life, and his shock at being picked up must have been incredible. I mean, he talks about in the Gulag Archipelago, which is one of his works, he talks about still thinking like an artillery officer. Even then, he couldn't believe that he'd been picked up. He made some other poor prisoner carry his bags because he was an officer. He shouldn't be carrying his own luggage. Well, he ends up in this prison, and realizes what he's in for, and realizes that they're not going to take no for an answer, because part of the narrative there is that the state organs, the security organs, the KGB, they never make mistakes. And they never make mistakes because they don't have to prove that they're right. You have to prove that they're wrong, and you're not given the means or the resources to do so, because they weren't really interested in the truth. They were interested in fulfilling norms, right? Stalin had given out numbers, lists, 5,000 from this city, 20,000 from that city, until the numbers got up into the tens of millions of people that had been arrested and sent off to camp. This would flow in waves, and usually it would flow in waves based on, whatever threat Stalin perceived was interfering with the success of his 5-year plans. So, if they weren't meeting norms in agriculture, well, there must be wreckers out there in the farming communities. It must be those kulaks who started organizing farming right after the revolution. Break it up. Go out there and arrest the people that were in charge, put them in the camps, put new people in charge. If it was a problem with infrastructure, it was the engineers. So years like 1937, 1938, you had whole segments of society, engineers, professors, doctors, whole strata of society picked up and arrested and given sentences of 5, 10, and 20 years on things like anti-Soviet agitation. I think Solzhenitsyn got that. And I think his included as a member of a group, because he was writing letters to somebody else. So they were a group. Praising foreign goods. That was a good one. Wrecking, sabotage. I mean, you name it. Anybody who had been a prisoner of war in World War II, when they came back home, they were arrested because they had lived in a foreign country. They were probably a spy. They'd probably been recruited. And if nothing else, they saw what life was like outside. And you couldn't have them talking about that. So anyway, so he gets arrested. He gets sent to, I think, somewhere around Tashkent, maybe it was Alma-Ata, and spent the next 8 years in various camps. Thankfully, I mean, for him, he was able to survive because he was able to cash in on his expertise with mathematics and actually get himself assigned to a technical camp. It was called a Sharashka, and these were camps where they would bring people that had specific technical skills and set them to work on problems of technologies, typically that the state really wanted. So a lot of the Soviet atomic program was done by former members of the intelligentsia and the technological fields that had become prisoners and then were brought out of the camps in order to build a bomb, something like that. So, but in order to keep himself sane, the whole time he was writing, he was composing. He actually composed an entire epic lyric poem in his head because he had nowhere to write it down. I mean, and this thing's like that thick, and he would just compose and memorize, compose and memorize. And by the time he got out, he was able to write it down. And at the same time, much like Dostoevsky 100 years before, his own understanding and evaluation of socialism and the Soviet project underwent a radical transformation, 180 degrees. And the sort of latent, questions and nagging doubts that he had that maybe before were just, directed towards this guy, Stalin, and were really just relegated to him and weren't necessarily about the project as a whole, he began to see as issues with the entire apparatus. So he ends up getting out of prison, and he's working as a math teacher in, I think, Ryazan, which is, somewhere out in the steppes, southeast of where everything's happening in Russia. And something miraculous happens, something incredible. Stalin had died, 53, I want to say, and Khrushchev came to power. And within, 5-8 years, there began to be a radical reevaluation of Stalin and his impact and role in the Soviet Union. And there was a party congress, I think it was the 21st or 22nd in 61, where Khrushchev made this speech basically denouncing Stalin, which nobody does. You don't do that. But he turned on its head the entire culture of hero worship that that had just been inculcated in the Soviet people. He basically said, we need to rethink all this. This guy was responsible for horrible things in our country, and we need to stop revering him as a hero. We need to start talking about what happened. Solzhenitsyn, he hears this, he gets wind of this, and it's like, I mean, can you even imagine? It would be like the clouds parting and the heavens opening. He thought that all these works that he'd been writing, and he had already written 3 or 4 of his major novels by then, would just sit. They would have to sit on the back burner. He'd probably never see them published. He was leaving them for posterity. Well, here's an opportunity to finally speak. So he sends his manuscript of A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich into Novy Mir. Now, Novy Mir was one of the more liberal publications in the Soviet Union. Of course, it was still run by the state, essentially, but it was helmed by a guy named Tvardovsky, who was a well-known writer and poet himself. And they had a much more open and aesthetically refined sense of what literature should be and could be. Most of the really good works, that maybe towed the line a bit in the Soviet realism sense, but still had some literary merit, were published through Novy Mir, and they're the ones who were typically knocking at the door to try to get more, new writers out there and, to push the boundaries a little bit farther. So he sends his manuscript down there. And A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, if you read it, or if you haven't, it's really not that controversial. I mean, you wouldn't think. It's a relatively short story. It's about 150 pages that just follows one day in the life of a prisoner from, the clang of the bell in the morning to lights out in the evening. And it's not a bad day. It's a good day, which is, I think, part of the genius of Solzhenitsyn in telling the story the way that he did. He's not like pushing horrors of camp life in your face. Nobody's getting beaten to death by guards. They're not having the dogs set on them. They're not being, left to freeze in the snow. It's not like the Kolyma where people went into the ground to mine gold and the clock was ticking. Like, you knew you were going to die within a couple of years, and they just kept throwing bodies out there. this was a good day. Like, he gets extra food that day. He's able to score some firewood. He finds himself, a piece of blade that he can use. He's able to get some tobacco. He pays the guards off. But all the bad stuff you're left to imagine, and that's kind of what makes it all the more powerful. It's like, holy shit, like, that's a good day. Wow. And this guy had to go through how many thousands of them? There's no real political commentary in it. It's not hitting you over the head with anything really overtly, but it almost didn't make it. It was picked up by I think a lower level office clerk, and she read it and realized that if she gave it to the editorial staff there, the guys that surrounded Twardowski and tried to rein in his more liberal tendencies, she knew that it probably would never get past them. So she found a way to do an end run around them and get it to Twardowski when he was going to be at his dacha for the weekend, and he read it. He said he stayed up all night and read it 3 times back to front. It was so powerful. It really was unlike anything that had been written previously, certainly that had ever been published. I mean, there were a few people that had written about the camps in the Soviet Union. They hadn't been published. Some of that work had surfaced in Samizdat, which was a underground self-publishing network that was operating mainly in Moscow. And it was mostly folks at home with typewriters, banging out copies of things that they knew would never get published and would probably get them arrested, but that people needed to read. So, people like Shalamov, who wrote Kolyma Tales, was one. Wonderful, gut-wrenching tales, short stories of what it was like to be a prisoner out in Kolyma, which was, out at the far end of Siberia. Vasily Grossman wrote a wonderful book called Life and Fate. He was a war correspondent, a Russian Jew, who was a correspondent for the Battle of Stalingrad, and he wrote a phenomenal book that both transports you there as a reader to what it was like in the trenches, that horrible battle, but also in kind of a war and peace sort of way gives you a picture of what was going on in these various strata of Soviet society at the time, with a special view towards Soviet culpability in the fate of the Jewish people, because most people don't realize this, but there was a pogrom going on in the Soviet Union against Jews that rivaled what Hitler did in Nazi Germany. They didn't have Jew-specific death camps, but they had the Gulag, and a lot of people could disappear there. So anyway, but that book never got published. It actually got arrested. The KGB got wind of it, probably read a copy that had been promulgated through Samizdat, and they showed up at his home, and they arrested his manuscripts, and they arrested his typewriters. They even took any typewriter ribbons that they could find in case they were imprinted with, text from the book. So he had to recreate that from memory at some point later. So Twardowski stays up all night. He's reading this thing, jaw dropped, and he ends up getting a copy, sending it straight away to the Minister of Culture, who reads it to Khrushchev, as he's out at his summer dacha hanging out. And Khrushchev is like, "This is perfect. This is what we need." It's Solzhenitsyn's trying to tell the truth as he saw it, but it also served the new narrative, right? The new party line. So it's green lighted, it's published, it goes into all the newspapers. It becomes an absolute literary sensation. And within a year, the party had reversed its stance, and they were reinstating Stalin, and Solzhenitsyn couldn't get anything published. And in fact, he was preparing to be arrested any day. He was just waiting for the knock at the door, because not only had he written that, but in the meantime, the KGB had actually found a cache of his manuscripts and confiscated them from one of the hiding places that he used. When he came out of the camps, he basically decided, I'm done playing the game. My life is dedicated towards telling the story of those that went through the camp experience, all those that died that can't tell their story. I'm going to reflect the truth to my culture of what's going on here, and what it makes of a human being. And so he becomes this like irascible character who is like hiding himself away, working on his manuscripts, shooting stuff over to Tvardovsky, shuttling manuscripts around to various hidey holes and people that he knows that can get stuff out of the country if he gets arrested. Shooting off like bombastic letters to whatever state, organ, he can think of that has sway in a particular situation. Like, when the Soviet Union went into Czechoslovakia to put down their uprising, he sends off a letter. When they go and arrest, who was it? Medvedev, he was a well-known geneticist, who opposed Lysenko, who was like the official state biologist. They ended up picking him up and forcibly committing him to a loony bin against his will. He sends off a letter. When the KGB took his manuscripts and started publishing works that he never wanted published, and made those like the most inflammatory of his writings, made those the talking points. He's sending out letters and acting completely differently from, your cowed Soviet citizen. They didn't know what to do with him. So I think part of what drove him, though, was that it wasn't just vitally important to him to tell the truth about historically what was going on. He wanted to get at the root of what he believed human beings really needed to confront and deal with in order to fully be human and to live as they ought to live. And I think we see that hinted at in something like Ivan Denisovich. So I'm going to read you something real quick. So this is at the end of the day, and they're all in their bunks again. And Denisovich, who is like your typical hard-bitten camp survivor, he's done with his day. He just wants to sleep. It's like, this is my blessed 30 minutes where no one's yelling at me. I don't have to be anywhere. I can just lay down here in bed and fish that piece of bread out of my mattress that I sewed in earlier. So one of the other guys that's sleeping there near him is this character Alyosha, who's part of this, kind of Baptist group. And they're seen as like, they're hard workers and they're honest, but they're kind of weird. They're backwards. Alyosha, he said, withdrawing his arm and blowing smoke into his face, I'm not against God. Understand that. I do believe in God. I don't believe in paradise or in hell. Why do you take us for fools and stuff us with your paradise and hell stories? That's what I don't like. He lay back, dropping his cigarette ash with care between the bunk frame and the window, so as to singe nothing of the captains below. He sank into his own thoughts, and he didn't hear Alyosha's mumbling. Well, he said conclusively, however much you pray, it doesn't shorten your stretch. You sit it out from beginning to end anyhow. Well, you mustn't pray for that either, said Alyosha, horrified. Why do you want freedom? In freedom, your last grain of faith would be choked with weeds. You should rejoice that you're in prison. Here you have time to think about your soul. As the Apostle Paul wrote, why all these tears? Why are you trying to weaken my resolution? For my part, I am ready not merely to be bound, but even to die for the name of the Lord Jesus. Shukov, who's Denisovich, gazed at the ceiling in silence. Now, he didn't know either whether he wanted freedom or not. At first, he'd longed for it. Every night, he'd counted the days of his stretch. how many had passed and how many were coming. And then he'd grown bored with counting. And then it became clear that men like him wouldn't ever be allowed to return home, that they'd be exiled. And whether his life would be any better there than here, well, who could tell? Freedom meant one thing to him, home, but they wouldn't let him go home. Alyosha was speaking the truth. His voice and eyes left no doubt that he was happy in prison. You see, Alyosha, Shukov explained to him, somehow it works out all right for you. Jesus Christ wanted you to sit in prison, and so you are, sitting there for his sake. But for whose sake am I here? Because we weren't ready for war in 41? For that? Was that my fault? And it goes on. I mean, he didn't have to put that character in there. But it's fascinating that at the end of the day, you have that interaction between the two of them. You know, kind of a counterpoint to the experience of this one character whose narrative you've been invested in this whole time. And it makes me wonder why, as a writer and as an artist, did Solzhenitsyn choose to add that narrative element in? You know, what is it about the larger human narrative that he wants to bring to the forefront for you as the reader? I'm going to try to race through some stuff because I'm running low on time. So this is from a transcript of an I guess it would be like a board meeting between Solzhenitsyn and a number of government functionaries. I absolutely do not understand, this is Solzhenitsyn speaking, why Cancer Ward is accused of being anti-humanitarian. So Cancer Ward was a novel that he wrote based on his own experiences as a cancer patient in a cancer treatment facility in somewhere in the East. And he uses it as a wonderful platform to explore how these various characters' ideologies prepare them or don't prepare them to deal with death. The fact that they're staring it full in the face. Quite the reverse is true. Life conquers death. The past is conquered by the future. Were this not the case, my character is such that I could never have set out to write it. But I do not believe that it is the task of literature, whether it is concerned with society or with the individual, to conceal the truth from them or to tone it down. Rather, I believe that it is the task of literature to tell people truthfully how things are and what awaits them. We hear the same rule expressed in Russian proverbs. Love the straight talker, not the sweet talker. Friendship does not speak with a honeyed tongue. In general, the task of the writer cannot be reduced to defense or criticism of this or that mode of distributing the social product, or to defense or criticism of one or another form of government. The tasks of the writer are connected with more general and durable questions, such as the secrets of the human heart and conscience and the confrontation between life and death, the triumph over spiritual sorrow, the laws of humanity over the ages, laws that were born in the depths of time immemorial and will cease to exist only when the sun ceases to shine. That's a theme that he would then continue to take up and hammer home throughout his career, and a theme that, you know, eventually got him kicked out of the country. His scrambling and running and trying to get published, and even his being awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, although the Soviets made sure that he couldn't receive it, all of that came for naught, because the final blow came when a copy of Gulag Archipelago, this is one volume of it. He had kind of two masterworks in his life. One is Gulag Archipelago, where he does kind of narrative history. He had interviewed and collected the stories of probably at least 100 different people that had gone through the Gulag system, as well as a tremendous amount of research both into the Gulag's roots back in the Tsarist penal system, and then, you know, the shape and direction and flow of the Gulag up through the Soviet system. And he wrote these volumes as a way to tell that story, how did the prison camp system in our country come about? How does it function? And what are the stories of those that have gone through it? And he interweaves that history with the narratives of specific people that were there and went through it and what their stories were, and also his own story. So you're constantly anchored back into, and this is what happened to me here, and this is what it was like for me, at this stage of the journey. And you can imagine how, this was dynamite. This was the most dangerous book you could imagine, because the camps were still going on. The people that were culpable for this were still in power, And a copy of this got smuggled to the West and was translated and published. So there's in The Oak and the Calf, there's a wonderful section. This is kind of a literary memoir of his, where he gives you like a moment-by-moment, play-by-play rundown of the night that they finally come to call, and they knock on the door, and they tell him, we're here for all your manuscripts, and, you are wanted by Abakumov, and we'd like to talk to you down at the Lubyanka. Won't you please come with us? And they put him in the Black Maria, and they drive him over there, and he thinks he's dead. He thinks that they're going to kill him. And he decides, well, I'm done playing the game. I'm not going to play the game, So that's the first thing he tells him, like, you can do whatever you want to me. Like, I'm not signing anything, Like, the world knows. They know. So they decided that the best thing that they could do, because, the guy's a Nobel laureate. He's famous. At this point, he had been taken up as kind of a scion of Soviet resistance in the West. They decide they can't kill him, The best thing that they can do is put him on a plane and kick him out of the country, which is what they end up doing. He just like Lenin, ends up in Zurich for a little while, and then he ends up going to Vermont. I think that one of the colleges out there offered to give him a home and a place to stay and money as long as he wanted to live there and write and do his thing, and that's what he ended up doing. And while he was there, he was given the opportunity to come and give a commencement address at Harvard. And, I think people in the West are thinking, all right, we get to hear this guy, get up there and ream the Soviet Union again. And he gets up there, and it's just beautiful. I don't know if it's just because he was so cantankerous, or because like his natural personal narrative identity was found in opposition to whatever social structure and government he found himself in, or if it's because he was perceptive enough to be able to see the failures in the West as well. But man, he gets up there and he says, now let me tell you about the problems in the Soviet Union. Now let me tell you about the problems in your country. And he does not pull punches. All right, I'm going to read this to you. It's just phenomenal. So he's talking about the rise of humanism in the West and humanist materialism, and how he sees its cultural legacy and impact as he sees it in the West. It has made man the measure of all things on earth, imperfect man, who is never free of pride, self-interest, envy, vanity, and dozens of other defects. We are now paying for the mistakes which were not properly appraised at the beginning of the journey. On the way from the Renaissance to our days, we have enriched our experience, but we have lost the concept of a supreme, complete entity which used to restrain our passions and our irresponsibility. We have placed too much hope in politics and social reforms, only to find out that we were being deprived of our most precious possession, our spiritual life. It's trampled by the party mob in the East and by the commercial one in the West. This is the essence of the crisis. The split in the world is less terrifying than the similarity of the disease afflicting its main sections. If, as claimed by humanism, man were born only to be happy, he wouldn't be born to die. Since his body is doomed to death, his task on earth evidently must be more spiritual, not a total engrossment in everyday life, not the search for the best ways to obtain material goods and then their carefree consumption. It has to be the fulfillment of a permanent, earnest duty so that one's life journey may become, above all, an experience of moral growth, to leave life a better human being than one started it. It is imperative to reappraise the scale of the usual human values. Its present incorrectness is astounding. It is not possible that assessment of the president's performance should be reduced to the question of how much money one makes or the availability of gasoline. Only by the voluntary nurturing in ourselves of freely accepted and serene self-restraint can mankind rise above the world stream of materialism. Today, it would be retrogressive to hold on to the ossified formulas of the Enlightenment. Such social dogmatism leaves us helpless before the trials of our times. Even if we were spared destruction by war, life will have to change in order not to perish on its own. We cannot avoid reassessing the fundamental definitions of human life and human society. Is it true that man is above everything? Is there no superior spirit above him? Is it right that man's life and society's activities should be ruled by material expansion above all? Is it permissible to promote such expansion to the detriment of our integral spiritual life? If the world has not approached its end, it has reached a major watershed in history, equal in importance to the turn from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. It will demand from us a spiritual blaze. We will have to rise to a new height of vision, to a new level of life where our physical nature will not be cursed, as in the Middle Ages, but even more importantly, our spiritual being will not be trampled upon as in the modern era. This ascension is similar to climbing onto the next anthropological stage. No one on earth has any other way left but upward. Can you imagine being a Harvard grad listening to that? What are some of the narratives that you see behind the words that he's speaking there? Yes.
I speak kind of softly. Is this picking up? Okay. When I think of Denisovich, I always think of what a primer it is, and I think that was its power, because the authorities understood that if you read this book and you studied it as a survival primer, not just physically, but spiritually, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, this thing packs a punch in a short read, and I think that was the power. Similar to Nathan Sharansky's Fear No Evil, where he goes more into the intellectual sort of ping-pong match in the interrogation, and he goes into great detail, but there's great strength there, because that's the human spirit. You know, there's a strength in us that totalitarians just can't conquer.
So he's wanting to bring to the fore that strength that you're talking about?
In a story. And I think in particular it's kind of poignant of the old guy. I think he's the long-time prisoner who had, with his primitive spoon, and he refused to succumb to the oppression, and he sat up straight, and he took that spoon, and he maintained his dignity, which was kind of shocking. Kind of the narrator gives a kind of a cynical take on it, and yet it is impressive that even then, it speaks to the strength of the human spirit, which they just can't conquer. So yeah, it was powerful.
Okay, I want to do a a quick narrative exercise. I haven't really delved into the narratives that our culture is employing right now, and I don't really I don't want to so much do the let's evaluate all the narratives, talk about this narrative and that narrative and how horrible this narrative is and how horrible that narrative is, because we just don't have the time. But I wanted to play something for you guys that, again, you may think this is kind of cheating, this is below the belt. But I promise you I didn't pick this, out of political considerations or just because it's an easy target, but kind of because it is easy, because there's all sorts of narratives in play, and it's easier to see them because it's come out that they're fabricated. So I want to watch this, and maybe we can try to suss out, like, okay, what are some of the narratives that we see in play here? Hello? Do 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 do.
I'm Robin Roberts in New York. Musician and actor Jesse Smollett sat down with me for his first interview since that night in Chicago. Smollett told me how he's doing now and responds to those who doubt his account.
I'm pissed off.
What is it that has you so angry? Is it the attackers?
It's the attackers, but it's also the attacks. It's like, at first it was a thing of like, listen, if I tell the truth, then that's it, because it's the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Then it became a thing of like, oh, how can you doubt that? Like, how do you not believe that? It's the truth. And then it became a thing of like, oh, it's not necessarily that you don't believe that this is the truth. You don't even want to see the truth.
What happened that night, Jesse?
When I landed in Chicago, and Frank Gatson, who's like my uncle, and he's also my creative director, and he picked me up. And then we got back to the apartment. There was no food. And so I went out to Walgreens thinking that they were 24 hours then to have a smoke. Walgreens was closed. So I called him up and I said, hey, I'm gonna run to Subway, which was across the street, and I'm gonna get a salad. Do you want anything? I went to the Subway and got the order. During that time, I texted my manager, thinking that he was still in Australia, because he was on an Australian tour with one of his other clients. I said, call me when you can. He called me immediately. And while he was on the phone, I heard, as I was crossing the intersection, I heard Empire. I don't answer to Empire. My name ain't Empire. And I didn't answer. I kept walking, and then I heard Empire. So I turned around and I said, did you just say to me? And I see the attacker masked, and he said, this MAGA country punches me right in the face. So I punched his ass back. And then we started tussling. It was very icy, and we ended up tussling by the stairs. Fighting. There was a second person involved who was kicking me in my back. And then it just stopped. And they ran off. And I saw where they ran. And the phone was in my pocket, but it had fallen out. And it was sitting there. And my manager was still on the phone. So I picked up the phone and I said, Brandon. And he's like, what's going on? And I said, I was just jumped. And then I looked down and I see that there's a rope around my neck, which I hadn't.
You hadn't noticed it before?
No, because it was so fast. You know what I'm saying? It was so fast.
How long did this all
It felt like minutes, but it probably was like 30 seconds, honestly. I can't tell you honestly. I noticed the rope around my neck and I started screaming. And I said, there's a rope around my neck.
Did you get any kind of description of the attack?
I gave a body description, and I, because I saw this, right here or whatever, but I didn't see, I can't tell you what color their eyes were. I can't tell you, and I did not see anything except the second person I saw running away. And the first person, I saw his stature. I gave the description as best as I could. You have to understand also that it's Chicago in winter. People can wear ski masks and nobody's gonna question that.
The police have gone through a lot of video and they were able to capture an image of two people of interest. Have you seen that image?
Mm-hmm.
And do you believe that they could possibly be the attackers?
I do.
What is it about their size, or why do you feel that they could possibly be?
Because I was there. For me, when that was released, I was like, okay, we're getting somewhere. I don't have any doubt in my mind that that's them. Never did.
Why did you hesitate to want to call the police?
You know, there's a level of pride there. We live in a society where, as a gay man, you were considered somehow to be weak. And I'm not weak. I'm not weak. And we are, as a people, are not weak. So, I mean, I can accept that there was pride there. There's also privacy. You know, at the end of the day, look what has happened. You know, look what has happened. So, I'm glad that Frank called the police. I'm glad that we reported it during that time before they came. It took them about maybe half hour to come. And during that time, I was looking at myself, just like checking myself out. I saw the bruise on my neck, you know, like the little, the rope burn around my neck. And then I smelled bleach. I know the smell of bleach. And I saw on my sweatshirt, it had marks on it, like spots on it, when you have a bad bleach job. So then I was like, there's bleach on me too. So when the police came, I kept the clothes on. I kept the rope.
So you had the rope on the entire
I mean, it
time?
wasn't like wrapped around, but yeah, it was around because I wanted them to see. I wanted them to see what this was. I told them what happened, everything. I also asked them to turn their body cams off because they were trying to stay in the hallway. And I was like, please just come in. Like, I don't want a big scene with my neighbors and with like the second round of police officers. I went down to where it happened and I walked them through exactly what happened. And I looked up and I saw that there was a camera directly on the light post that is in the intersection. So I'm like, there it is.
A potential break in the case that would eventually fall apart days later.
And then the detective told me that the camera inside of the casing was facing north. So they didn't have it. And that was disappointing.
The vast majority of people have been supportive and loving and understanding. And then as time has gone on, and that there's no, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, you're going to Subway.
Subway is open 24 hours. Like, people kill me when they say things like that because it's like Subway is open 24 hours for a reason. So that when you're hungry at night and you ain't got no food, you go to Subway. The camera facing north, how is that my issue? It feels like if I had said it was a Muslim or a Mexican or someone black, I feel like the doubters would have supported me a lot more. And that says a lot about the place that we are in our country right now. The fact that we have these fear mongers, these people that are trying to separate us, and it's just not okay. It's just not okay. And for all of the people, the next time that you see someone report something, maybe well after the fact that it happened, and you say to them, well, why are you waiting till now? Just remember that mine was reported right away. And look what has happened.
The phone.
Mm-hmm.
When did you, because as you said...
Anyway, we could go on.
The timeline,
But
valuable information. When did you make that information available?
this just keeps going, doesn't it?
to the police?
Technology, that's amazing. My computer is not that
Originally asked for my phone
technological.
records. They asked for my phone.
Do, do,
They
do.
wanted me to give my phone to the tech for 3 to 4 hours. I'm sorry, but
Okay, so what are some of the narratives that you guys see are in play here? Anybody? I was talking with a friend of mine about this, and he said that it was very interesting how Smollett seemed very concerned with being seen as both a victim and a hero, that both were true, which I thought was really insightful and pretty significant, that there is a kind of victim-hero narrative that he's tapping into or utilizing for how he's portraying himself in this situation. But But it seems like that's a huge narrative in our culture right now, you know, the victim hero, that somehow if you are victimized in some sense, then your overcoming that is more heroic. So, and I'm not trying to pick on that over other things. That's just what I'm seeing here in this particular example. What are some other narratives?
A concern with believing accusations brings up my story came out immediately, but he's referencing other situations where it's not reported for a long time, and there's sort of a general feeling like you're not going to believe a particular kind of testimony.
So, yeah, so victims in there should be believed. Yeah, I'd say that's definitely there. Yeah, I think that's a big theme with like the Me Too movement. So, I was parked the other day behind a car that said "Believe women" on their bumper sticker. You know, and I'm not saying that women shouldn't be believed, but it's an interesting statement, carte blanche. You know. So. Any other narratives?
I mean, are these narratives coming out of? I mean, obviously, there is a narrative. Obviously, there's the narrative of the news. I mean, we're looking at the long tradition of slavery that doesn't just exist in the South. It's much more widespread than that locality. So it's not the case that this person isn't keen about his development of those symbols. But there are effectively narratives and counter narratives. I mean, like we're not existing in a state. I mean, this is sort of what Derrida is so useful for in regards to like exegeting out the cultural. And again, is it cultural Marxism or is it cultural capitalism at this point? I mean, the media is itself its own capitalistic enterprise. It has its own agenda for profit. So the narrative is not just the narrative of cultural forces and cultural voices, but it's even the kind of way our capitalist structure engages in entertainment and media, which is, again, this is on the news, and they need to make money off of it. So again, like, what's interesting is that we are living in such a our culture is so streamed with voices and equivocity that it's difficult to determine which narratives are the counter narratives anymore. I mean, Donald Trump also has a victim hero role that he plays. He plays the same one.
Sure.
But that's what I mean. It's like we're wading into this one story, and I liked your identification that the hero victim, the duality has to exist. You have to take power back, but effectively you also have to declare the power is taken from you. That's across the board. I mean, that's the new motif.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that like this guy represents some like horrifying development that only exists, you know, coming out of the mouth of Jussie Smollett. Like, absolutely not. Like, there have to have been, you know, social narratives there ready for the picking that made him feel comfortable doing what he did, you know, casting himself and the actions that he took in a way where he could sleep at night and go, yeah, I can do that. Like, I'm down with doing that because of X, Y, and Z. Like, and that's what's fascinating to me. Like, that's so what narratives do you see, you know, here? Like, do you see any specific narratives like behind the choices he's making in the way that he's telling his story? Or
maybe you could ask your question another way, in the sense of besides the hero victim narrative.
Yeah.
I mean, part of the narrative is that he doesn't feel believed.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah.
And again, addressing why that's a common theme as well. I mean, it's not just that the Believe Women bumper sticker is a flat statement, but the fact that there's some sort of wound within our society that statement has to be even made is also very interesting to me. And identifying where that wound comes from and identifying the historical grounding of that wound. I mean, I think these are interesting moments in the reconstruction of narrative. And I mean, unfortunately, the political typically wants to close those things down, which is what I like about Solzhenitsyn as well. I mean, like, the most common theme of what you're talking about is that the political is the problem. The political wants to close things. The political wants to otherize the other narratives. But in reality, I mean, what we're doing, and whether it's a sort of spiritual quest that Solzhenitsyn's going to bring up, I would prefer also. I mean, I was going to ask you what your thoughts on Solzhenitsyn, if the spiritual does it all, or if some level of personal, I don't know, scholarship, some level of inquiry. I mean, I was wondering what your opinion of what Solzhenitsyn would say is that he's tying it to the spiritual. But when we look at these varying counter narratives, and we look at the political agenda being one that casts one side against the other, closes down dialogue and discourse as opposed to open it, does Solzhenitsyn have an opinion about, how we become sophisticated?
He does.
I opened it right up.
That is such a perfect segue.
That's what I thought.
I hired him to come do this. Okay.
Are we leaving your question at this point?
Yeah.
Back to your question?
Absolutely. Okay. So this is a little essay that he wrote. It's short, I promise. It's called Live Not by Lies. At one time, we dared not even whisper. Now we write and read samizdat, and sometimes when we gather in the smoking room of the Science Institute, we complain frankly to one another. What kind of tricks are they playing on us? Where are they dragging us? There is gratuitous boasting of cosmic achievements while poverty and destruction exist at home. Propping up remote uncivilized regimes, fanning up civil war, we recklessly fostered Mao Zedong at our expense, and we shall be the ones sent to war against him, and we'll have to go. Is there any way out? They put anybody they want on trial and put sane people in asylums. Always they. We are powerless. Things have almost reached rock bottom. A universal spiritual death has already touched us all, and physical death will soon flare up and consume us and our children. But as before, we still smile in a cowardly fashion and mumble with our tongues tied. Well, what can we do to stop it? We haven't the strength. We've been so hopelessly dehumanized that for today's ration of food, we are willing to abandon all our principles, our souls, and the efforts of our predecessors, as well as all the opportunities for our descendants. Just don't disturb our fragile existence. We lack resolution, pride, and enthusiasm. We don't even fear universal nuclear death, nor do we fear a third world war. Perhaps we can hide in crevices. We just fear acts of civil courage. We're afraid to lag behind the herd and to take one step alone, and suddenly to find ourselves without white bread, heating gas, and a Moscow registration. What was drummed in our ears at political courses, we have now internalized. Live comfortably, and all will be well ever after. You cannot escape your environment and social conditions. Existence determines consciousness. What does it have to do with us? We can't do anything about it. But we can. We lie to ourselves to preserve our peace of mind. It is not they who should be blamed, but ourselves. One can object, but cannot imagine what to do. Gags have been stuffed into our mouths. Nobody wants to listen to us, and nobody asks our opinion. How can we force them to listen to us? It is impossible to change their minds. It would be logical to vote them out of office, but there are no elections in our country. In the West, people resort to strikes and protest demonstrations, but we are too downtrodden, and it is too horrifying for us. How can one suddenly renounce a job and take to the streets? Other fatal paths tested during the last century by our bitter Russian history are even less suitable for us, and truly we do not need them. Now that the axes have done their work and everything that was sown has sprouted, we can see that the young and presumptuous people who thought that they would make our country just and happy through terror, bloody rebellion, and civil war were themselves misled. No thanks, fathers of enlightenment. Now we know that infamous methods breed infamous results. Let our hands be clean. Is the circle closed? Is there really no way out? Is there only one thing left to do, to wait without taking any action? Maybe something will happen by itself, but it will never happen as long as we daily acknowledge, extol, and strengthen, and do not sever ourselves from the most perceptible of all of its aspects, lies. When violence intrudes into peaceful life, its face glows with self-confidence as if it were carrying a banner and shouting, "I am violence. Run away. Make room for me. I will crush you." But violence quickly grows old. After only a few years, it loses confidence in itself. And in order to maintain a respectable face, it summons falsehood as its ally. Since violence can conceal itself with nothing except lies, and the lies can be maintained only by violence, violence does not lay its paw on every shoulder every day. It demands from us only obedience to lies and daily participation in lies. And this submissiveness is the crux of the matter. The simplest and most accessible key to our self-neglected liberation is this: personal non-participation in lies. Though lies may conceal everything, though lies may control everything, we should be obstinate about this one small point. Let them be in control, but without any help from any of us. This opens a breach in the imaginary encirclement caused by our inaction. It's the easiest thing for us to do and the most destructive for the lies, because when people renounce lies, it cuts short their existence. Like a virus, they can only survive in living organisms. Let us admit it. We have not matured enough to march into the squares and shout the truth out loud, or to express aloud what we think. It is not necessary. It's dangerous. But let us refuse to say what we do not think. This is our path, the easiest and most accessible one, which allows for our inherent, well-rooted cowardice. And it's much easier, it's shocking even to say this, than the sort of civil disobedience that Gandhi advocated. Our path is not that of giving conscious support. Our path is that of not giving conscious support to lies about anything at all. And once we realize where the parameters of falsehood are, and everyone sees them in their own way, our path is to walk away from this gangrenous boundary. If we didn't paste together the dead bones and scales of ideology, if we did not sew together the rotting rags, we would be astonished how quickly the lies would be rendered helpless and would subside. That which should be naked would then really appear naked before the whole world. So, in our timidity, let us each make a choice whether to remain consciously a servant of falsehood. Of course, it is not out of inclination, but to feed one's family, that one raises one's children in the spirit of lies, or to shrug off the lies and become an honest man worthy of respect from one's children and contemporaries. And then he goes on to give like a point by point, let's stop doing this, and let's stop doing this, and let's stop doing this. But most of it all comes down to, let's just stop participating in the lies, which I hope answers your question a bit, that there is a specific social action that he sees himself dedicated to, that all of his scholarship and writing are in the service of, and that he hopes he can inspire other people to do as well. Because I think what's so insidious, what's so necessary about narrative in giving us a foundation to understand ourselves and to relate ourselves to the events of our own lives is also what can be so insidious about it, because if we don't have the right narrative about ourselves, then we're going to evaluate ourselves wrongly. We're going to evaluate our lives wrongly. We're going to justify doing things that are suicide, or that are, false or sick or degrading. So how can we as people learn to identify, where the lies are, where the truth is, what the narrative is that I need to see myself through, and what the narrative is that I need to reflect back to other people in my choices and in my words, if that makes sense.
I've never seen that before, that video. And I was interested that he didn't go to sort of a classical race relations argument. Mm-hmm. He went to a different place that I've noticed some seems to be the sort of enlightened way to understand acts of animus between human beings, which is a hateful act has as its motivation separating us. I don't think that's the word he used. I think he said it well, maybe he did. It keeps us apart, or
Yeah.
it separates
Yeah.
us. And I've heard that a fair amount in the arguments, particularly with respect to white supremacy, with nationalism, with a range of maladies, societal maladies. They are pointed out not to be the stemming from a place of evil human beings acting evilly towards their neighbors,
Yeah.
but from a place of it just makes the rainbow society less together.
Yeah.
And that is the case that he made, instead of, I was jumped by a couple of guys who don't like black people. It was, they're trying to separate us. And the us, I think, is his sort of narrative notion of what a culture full of people with different understandings of what human beings are, all of those understandings of what human beings are equally valid, and what these guys were doing was claiming there wasn't equal validity.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that narrative choice gives his situation much broader appeal, because it's not just about, black people.
And it's not him
about-
and them guys.
Right, yeah.
It's those guys representing an entire culture,
Yeah.
and me representing an entire culture.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting.
So, slightly different, and I think that I hear you sort of making an argument that in reading the Russian authors, but also listening to interviews with movie stars, that we need to be thinking in terms of teasing out the narratives. And that, I found that to be hard. You ask questions of us, and I thought, and nothing happened.
I think it.
Wait a second. That could be sort of a
Yeah.
idiosyncratic problem,
No,
rather than a general one.
But also, it can be harder to do that. With a 10-minute interview that you've just seen and you haven't had time to sit down and stew over. I mean, think about your work. I mean, where this comes into play for me on a daily basis is when I go to work, and I work with about as far culturally as you can get from this dude. I work with a whole bunch of like hard working, hard drinking rednecks.
Yep.
And the narrative there is that, your value comes from, are you putting in your 40 hours plus a week? And, are you going to go out drinking with us on the weekend? And, I mean, it's just as materialist as anything else. It's like, what toys do you have? How hard do you work? They don't even care how you vote. It's the craziest thing. It's just like, are you getting hammered on the weekend, and are you going to be here on Monday?
Yeah.
And I've made some choices in my life that have necessitated that my work structure doesn't look like that. Like, I don't work full 40 hours a week because I go see my kids some of those days, but there's that pressure still that's there, and I have to be conscious of not buying into that narrative and not evaluating myself along those lines, and saying, well, no, I can't be here, and this is why, and like, I need to respect myself, and it'd be cool if you respected me for that. And if you don't, that's all right. Like, that's your thing. But
Have you tried explaining your understanding of the narrative character of your relationship with these people? Has it been helpful?
not in those words, no.
Okay. I just thought I might suggest you give it a try.
No. Although maybe there's a country song I could find that would, I don't know. So yeah, I mean, no matter where you go, there are narratives in play that are vying for your allegiance, in the sense of, you know, you've got to be intentional about how you are evaluating yourself in the light of those narratives that are around you. And, you know, some of those things are going to be fine, and some of them aren't. And they come from all over the place. So Solzhenitsyn, I happen to appreciate, because I think in a lot of ways he's got some really good insights, and he's one of those people that I keep coming back to be reminded, oh yeah, like, this is what's essential about the human narrative that I want to remember, and that I want to evaluate my life and my choices in the light of. So anyway, we're way over. I wish we had more time. Anyway, thanks you guys.